Chambers Dictionary, which I tend to use for this, describes superstition as an irrational belief, a belief in divination, agencies, magic, charms, but all, when it comes down to it, irrational. Now, Jewish people come from a community which has been bred on discussion and argument, and it depends totally what your viewpoint is as to what you regard as irrational. So one person may say a particular superstition has been there because it is tradition, and somebody else will turn around and say, no, it doesn't work, it isn't there. It's just something you picked up. But it's the influence, in many cases, of the people that we've actually moved through. People think that because we've labelled ourselves God's people, the Chumash labels us the chosen people, that we go through the world totally unaffected by the people amongst whom we live, and that is not true at all. We have picked up habits, we have picked up traditions in the desert as a tribal people, in the cities after the expulsion by the Romans and the Babylonians. We picked up traditions from them, and we used those traditions. We picked up from the Babylonians a whole gamut of astrology, and in exhibitions that we've had at the British Library and the British Museum, it's shown how Jewish merchants got involved with astrology, and some made a living by forecasting and working with agencies that helped the idea of conjuring something to make somebody's luck better. It's interesting to note how traditions have changed. If you like, one of the most obvious ones that is given out as a humour today is the extensions that have been put on a very old phrase in Yiddish. At a funeral, at a levoya, you find that somebody will not just wish the bereaved strength, but they might still use the phrase, du bist leben zu 120, you should live to be 120. Why 120? Moses lived to be 120. And if it's good enough for you, if it's good enough for Moses, it's good enough for you. But this was extended by a comedian in the 1950s, and it's still, the extension that he made is still there. Alan King was over here for a couple of tours, and because he was a Jewish comedian, he caught the imagination of the community. And Alan King, during a joke, a wisecrack, had actually said, the two characters had said in a story, you should live to be 120 and 6 months. Why 6 months? So you shouldn't die suddenly. And this sometimes has stuck, and I've heard this given out at funerals by people who take the phrase seriously. So therefore slipped into the consciousness of tradition. When you talk about the superstitions that are levelled at the older members of the community and the young, and particularly the protection of the young, you come across the traditions of what we call the Bloodstruf, the red ribbon. And normally what happens is I talk about the history of this element, how it started with us as a tribe in the desert, concerned with the beliefs of the people around us who were picking off our stragglers. And in the cases of many of the children, they were sent by these tribes to a temple in the desert where they were sacrificed to the gods of Canaan as child sacrifices. And so abhorrent was it to the people that they had a certain degree of fear that although the Bible says that the God of the Jews is the only one, it also says, your God is greater than all the other gods, which suggests that beliefs in other deities have their place. But because of the fact that these deities had Jewish children sacrificed to them, the people developed an abhorrence to those particular deities, and, if you like, offered votive offerings, placatory, and the beginnings of the bloodstuff may have been part of the circumcision, and rites where perhaps blood or a bloodletting or a little cut of blood was dropped on the ground to placate the gods in whose territory we were moving through, so they should not afflict the children of the tribes. And what happens now is, I mention all this and the traditions that even today grandparents will occasionally put on a red ribbon round a child's wrist or somewhere in the pram, so that the child shouldn't be overlooked by anybody who has the ayin hara, the evil eye, a person who can be jealous and turn the fate of others. And in the case of this, the red ribbon is a means of protection. You've made a sacrifice to the deity who may be controlling that person. And what has happened is that by so doing, you placate it. And the red ribbon then can be worn through life as a means of protection. And what happens when I'm talking to the women's groups is, many times at the end of a talk, after all the questions, as I'm leaving, I find ladies tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Excuse me, Mr. Reid, can I show you something?" And I turn and I say yes, and they will reveal a brass strap which has a red ribbon tied to it, and will say things like, "Mr. Reid, you see, I know what you're talking about, I understand."